So the reason we're looking at committees today is as staff was developing the program for the newly virtual event this week, we realized we have a tremendous amount of work to do in the next 5 years. It's a novel situation we are facing in regards to the tens of billions of dollars in new passenger rail funding that need oversight to ensure that they're invested wisely. It's going to be a lot of work along a number of different lines. And so we really, given the size of our staff, we need to take advantage of our assets as an organization. And we are blessed, rail passengers, with an extremely high level of regional and operational knowledge with our council and our membership. There are folks who are railroaders within the industry. They have a lot of different skill sets from other industries to bring, and of course they're just longtime passengers, and you all know the network better than a lot of Amtrak executives, frankly. So now is an excellent time to revitalize, to re-examine how we do committee work as an association, and think about how we can pivot to some of the tool sets, using some of the tool sets outlined in the last workshop to ensure we're producing really good materials. So the goal is, how can our committees produce materials that have a meaningful impact on ongoing policy discussions, on regulatory processes that are moving at the state and federal level, and of course, last but not least, influence the public conversation. The question we're going to try to answer is, what do we expect committees to produce, and how much time, what kind of time burden can we reasonably place upon committee members? You are volunteers. Questions to answer also include, how should our professional staff assist the committees in their work? How can we, given the 40% reduction in staff since the pandemic started? What is a reasonable time burden for us? Another one is, how can committees best convert their ideas into materials that are both polished, professional, substantive, and what kinds of materials do we foresee having an impact? Finally, and this often I think is not addressed as much as it should be, but what post-production work needs to be done after those materials are produced to ensure that the committee work doesn't just sit on a shelf, that it's not us just talking to each other, but that it gets a broader audience. So like I mentioned, I'll be joined by Dave Randall today. He's going to help me moderate, and I'm just going to get Dave, if you could unmute yourself so that
I think I'm unmuted now, aren't I?
I can hear you, and you can just go ahead and give your opening thoughts and kind of walk us briefly through your thoughts about the current committee structure.
Well, my thoughts on the committee structure right now is a lot of committees are working very well. Bylaws, routes and schedules. Let's see, generally the task force are working well, but there are some, especially when it gets into equipment service delivery, and that's carrier service delivery, and the some of those committees we're just not being listened to. We've got in the equipment committee, we've got to get a lot of input from our members, from our council members, from our membership about what they want to see in new equipment, especially involving creature comforts. Service delivery, onboard service, there's still a lot of issues there that need to be dealt with. A lot of improvements have been made, but a lot of improvements still need to be made, especially food and beverage service in the trains that haven't been upgraded. So that's about all I have right now. Sean, turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dave. So before I entered the 2 case studies, and again, I'm going to try to get through these relatively quickly so we leave a lot of time for discussion. Just if you have thoughts, ideas, comments that you think could guide discussion once we get to that part, feel free to enter them in the chat. Feel free to have the conversation as a sidebar. Someone's writing on my screen, and we're also going to have a couple poll questions that I put together because I saw Joe had them, and I figured I want the cool toys too. So actually, Joe, I don't know if you separated those out into individual polls or it's going to be en banc, but
it'll be one set of questions.
Yeah, why don't we have that first poll now? Poll question. And so while Joe pulls you, I want to kind of go through this case study. Case study number 1, it's a white paper that was produced by George Chilson in 2018. And it was released in 2018 rather. And it's called Amtrak's Route Accounting, Fatally Flawed, Misleading, and Wrong. It is, I think, a really good example of the material that could be produced by committees that have a meaningful impact on the policy conversation surrounding passenger trains. As an overview, let's see if I can get this out of the way. Thank you. This is a fairly straightforward package. I'm not going to say simple because, you know, there was a lot of research that went into it. There was a lot of review of the literature and bills that set this up, but it wasn't very complex. It was not a sprawling project. It was a 37-page white paper that explained why fully allocated costs favored by Amtrak, combined with their flawed route accounting system, just misrepresented the costs of operating long distance trains and national network trains, and how this was leading to bad policy decisions at the federal level. It was also a 6-page executive summary outlining the broad strokes and the most glaring instances of misallocation for those folks who did not want to read a 37-page white paper about railroad accounting. There are those folks out there, believe it or not. And then finally, a press release that we developed in conjunction with George and got out to the broad media and also the trade press. So, I mean, I will just say that again, it was very well researched. It looked at the statutory origin of the accounting system, prior congressional oversights, Amtrak Inspector General findings, how the responses by the Amtrak and FRA to these findings were inadequate. And it looked at potential policy fixes, and it put them into a very nice tight package that I was able to shop around the Hill, shop to members of the media. It was, it helped me do my job better as head of government affairs, because I understood the difference between fully allocated costs and marginal costs, and why that distorted the conversation around long distance routes. But you know, I didn't have this wealth of materials that were produced in the creation of this white paper, and I didn't have it down as an elevator pitch. And this really helped me better understand what was happening, because it was a delegation of the research function to a council member. And so, you know, it wasn't just helping me, it wasn't just helping me have conversations one-on-one with members of Congress and their staff. It also it steered the public conversation. So right here, you can see, I'm going to end this poll because it's in my way. Cool. You can see Amtrak's faulty route accounting, RPA. It's a headline from Railway Age. It was a really nice piece written by the editor-in-chief at Railway Age, and it got pretty good traction within the industry. It also generated a few more media inquiries from the general press, not just the trade press. I was on some of those calls with George, where we tried to walk through a reporter through what was happening. It is very complex, very technical, but what the white paper did and the executive summary did was it made it so that everyone could understand the issue. Sorry. I'm gonna have to close this out. All right, thank you. Thanks for everyone who participated in the poll. I think those are some that's a good kind of survey of where we're at. And it definitely, what it did is there, we've all read those articles where they say if only we could get rid of those money losing long distance routes, then the NEC wouldn't need federal funding, which is obviously just egregiously wrong. And this really helped me kill a lot of those stories and shape them into something more productive. It also steered the policy conversation. You can see here, section 22205 from the IIJA. It's improved oversight of Amtrak accounting. And we even had stronger language, frankly, in the House version, in the INVEST Act. Unfortunately, due to the vagaries of how the bill was moved, we weren't able to fight for it in reconciliation. But even this is an improvement, because it requires the USDOT to look at the language. Requires the USDOT to define, maintain, and periodically update the account structure to improve county methodologies, and it lets us have a seat at the table as passengers, because it will be operated through the USDOT, and there's certain transparency requirements that come with that. And it wasn't just the force of the argument, frankly. It was the fact that the coverage we got, and through the distribution of the paper, we found other allies who were interested in this. There's a lot of rail authorities and state rail departments who reached out to us at Rail Passengers because they'd been fighting their own battles with cost allocation through the Section 209 program, which is how you run state-supported routes. So it helped us find like-minded allies in this fight, and really beefed up the coalition. So I think that's a really good example of a committee report or a white paper that could be produced by a committee, and what you would want the impacts of that to be. I'm going to move to case study number 2.
John, Dave Randall here. Can I say something, please?
Please do. Please interject, Dave.
This is about the accounting report. In business, when you're adding a new service or adding a new product, what you have to do is determine your out-of-pocket costs, your variable costs of that. And what Amtrak is doing is picking up on the old rail Form A that the railroad used back in the 60s to get rid of the trains, and it's shoving a lot of costs that are normally overhead costs into out-of-pocket costs. So when that makes a new train begin, they say it costs a lot more than it really, the incremental cost is a lot higher than it really should be. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to see if I could answer.
If you have any questions, we have a white paper on it too. So
yes.
feel free to, it's on our website still. You can look it up, just look up that title, and we'll send out the link also, by the way, when we send out the link to this PowerPoint deck. So number 2, thank you, Dave, that's for that clarification. I think that's helpful. But case study number 2 looks at the U.S. regulatory and procurement environment for passenger rail equipment as a way to think about some committee inputs, parameters, frankly, deadlines that need to be understood to work effectively. And I didn't choose passenger rail equipment because I was picking on the equipment committee. I just think it's something that people are broadly interested in. our membership and our council, and everyone has a lot of ideas about it, and there's a lot of things happening. So it seemed an information-rich stream to analyze in terms of what committees are going to have to deal with to make sure that they are addressing the facts on the ground and we're not just talking amongst ourselves. So, you know, like all conversations in railroading, because it's been around for forever, pick where you want to join. It's always going to be in the middle of some new conversation that's launching off the conclusion of something else that's been influenced by some new act of Congress. So I just looked at the passage of PREA 2008, which produced the Section 305 required Amtrak to establish a next generation corridor equipment pool committee. It's comprised of Amtrak, other operators such as Texas Central, Brightline, as well as representatives from the states, the FRA, host freight railroad companies, as well, and OEMs, original equipment manufacturers. So a lot of what the committee does is just technical work. And I wouldn't necessarily, I know we have engineers in our association, in our council. And so, you know, potentially we could have input in that, but it wasn't just about technical specifications, it was about procurement, and it was about fleet standardization, the makeup of the fleets. It looked at, you know, how do you standardize as much as possible what is in the fleets, minimize the number of car types and configurations, to make maintenance easy, to make it low cost, and to increase reliability, while also still addressing the unique needs of each route to maximize ridership and revenue. And so I think this is something that even if we don't want to dig into the engineering work, we probably have an opinion on consist types. But that means being part of this really big and relatively high speed for the federal government conversation. You can see here the number of documents and the documentation produced by this committee, beginning in 2012 and going up to just 2 years ago. And so we're not going to go through all of these, but obviously something like the next generation bi-level passenger rail car specifications that were issued in 2016, and the next generation single level passenger rail car specifications in 2019. Those are going to be of interest to our members. And I would like to think that we would have an equipment committee where we would be part of this conversation. That doesn't mean that's not easy. And so I just highlighted here their meeting schedule. And they meet quite often, and I've been on a few of them, and I wouldn't call them thrilling pieces of entertainment. Frankly, it's a lot of nitty gritty work with engineers, with bureaucrats, with people talking about supply chains and procurement best practices. But it is a conversation that we need to be part of. And frankly, as much as anything, it's about building relationships. And so, you know, this is something that I wish we had enough staff to reliably do, but I think since we don't, just to be frank, this is something potentially we could have committee members do, and we could, you know, potentially see about getting non-voting participation in these committees. But again, a lot of work. Shifting focus here really quickly, it's not just about what's happening at the regulatory level, what's happening at meetings between government officials. There's also just some facts on the ground that we have to acknowledge if we want to be taken seriously when we produce white papers, studies, reports out of committee. So I just looked here real quickly at the limited manufacturer supply base domestically. If you look at that chart on the left, that's actually 2007, so very out of date. I couldn't find anything more up to date, more current, and I think that tells you something in itself about the limited number of manufacturers working within the U.S. And on the right, we have a map put out by the Rail Supply Institute, and that may look like a lot of, sorry, there's an ambulance there. That may look like a lot of suppliers, but a lot of those companies specialize in freight rail equipment. So again, having participated in some and reviewed some of the documentation that come out of not just the NGEC, but also the State Amtrak Intercity Passenger Rail Equipment Committee, supply chain has been an issue. And you know, we don't have to dig too far to come up with an example of a procurement that was just really catastrophically derailed, frankly. And of course, I'm talking about the 130 bi-level rail cars that were supposed to supplement and replace single level amphitheats and horizon cars in the Midwest, and bi-level Surfliner and California cars in California. They were contracted out to Nippon Sharyo, who was very experienced in the Japanese market. They set up a manufacturing base in Rochelle, and the company, just given the restrictions on using American steel and as a result of Buy America, American components as a result of Buy America, looking at the labor situation and their unfamiliarity with the FR regulations, and specifically, I think regulations around buff strength, they just were not able to ever produce anything that was capable of operating within the U.S. market. And at the end of the day, they threw up their hands, they gave up, and that manufacturing plant in Illinois was just shut down. And those 130 bi-levels turned into 137 single level cars. And Siemens picked up the order, and I think we're on our way to getting those out, but it is unfortunately it set it back many years longer than it needed to be. And so again, these are the kinds of realities that I would expect our committees to acknowledge if we want to have an impact on the real world conversation. So, and I did talk with a few members who were saying, like, well, I mean, bi-levels, they exist. I've been on them. It's not like they're a theoretical particle that we have to like wonder at. And that is true, but
Sean, can I add
a lot
something?
has changed, frankly, in the domestic manufacturing sector since they were last produced. And it's something that we really need to acknowledge.
Sean, can I add something here, please?
Sure.
You're talking about the bi-levels that crumpled in Rochelle. When they built all of the other bi-levels, they use a Bud company developed a shot weld process to attach these cars. Now, the lower level on all the bi-levels is a great big heavy box, and the shot weld held the stress, allowed for a proper stress test. Well, EPA does not allow the process. The shot weld gives off gases that the EPA objected to, so they couldn't send the cars to Canada or to Spain or to South America to have that shot weld done. It had to be done in the United States. And Nippon Sharyo was the only one who was going to take on that challenge, and we know the rest of the story there. But it was a construction issue, EPA issue, and something that we really didn't have a lot to do with. I'm done.
Thanks, Dave. So, you know, again, these are the many complex inputs that go into and considerations that theoretically we could take into account. Another strategy here is just to be the voice of the passenger, and this could be the sole focus, or this could be in addition to whatever we're doing at a more in-depth, complicated, and structural level. But it presents its own problems, its own challenges, rather. So Amtrak has been releasing media on their next generation Acela, and you can see here some of the features, the onboard amenities they've highlighted, including enhanced onboard information systems, increased outlets, the addition of USB ports, adjustable reading lights, as well as some more accessibility focused features such as handles integrated into seat backs, bathrooms with 60-inch turning radius. So perhaps this is the focus. Perhaps we as an association want to limit ourselves to the passenger facing features of what we're providing oversight on, provide, just outcome-based recommendations for, it doesn't just have to be equipment, of course, it could be route development, it could be corridor identification and route selection. And so, but again, some of those challenges I want to highlight are, Amtrak announced this procurement in 2016, testing began in 2019. When do we become part of that? How do we know when to become part of that conversation? How do we know who to give our recommendations to? We can give them to Amtrak, of course, but we do need to make sure that it's not just Amtrak, because Amtrak will accept our recommendations and they will act on them sometimes. But frankly, we need to be working with members of Congress who oversee appropriations, members of Congress interested in accessibility issues. We need to engage accessibility groups, talk to the public to make sure it's not just us sending a letter to Amtrak officials that they'll read and file away, and maybe they act on it, maybe they don't. It needs to be part of a more strategic approach, and that requires understanding where the process is. And I'm going to go back to that NGEC slide. It means being part of those meetings so that we understand where the procurement is, and can get our input in before plans are locked in. One of the meetings I was in for the Next Generation Equipment Committee, they talked about how the request for proposals had entered the cone of silence. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that reference, and it can be the situation where the lines of responsibility become very blurry when you get to that level of a government procurement with hundreds of millions of dollars, and a lot of people, when you go and ask them, specifically, I worked with the Amtrak Bike Coalition, and we were just trying to get bike storage on the luggage cars, and the runaround we got was incredible between states, because it was going to go towards some state-supported corridors, as well as Amtrak operations on the Northeast Corridor, and trying to get a straight answer about who made the ultimate decision was very difficult. And again, it's based on building those relationships through the speccing process. So I've been talking for a while now. I do want to take a moment to kind of summarize some discussion points here before we begin, but I will turn it over to you after this, and Dave's going to help lead on moderation. But I think some of the things that we need to consider as we restructure and reorganize and revitalize, in some cases, committees is how do we identify external deadlines, not just internal deadlines for us, but external deadlines, to make sure that we aren't a few weeks after they announce the procurement or a few weeks after they finalize the Southeast Regional Rail Network map, come out with our recommendations, because that's just too late in the game. How do we engage relevant regulatory processes? How do staff and committees work together to understand what is happening in any given moment? and what Congress has asked for. Certainly, we've already talked a little bit about this with the corridor identification program, those long distance daily service restoration studies. But there's more out there. Proper scoping. Do we want to be more passenger focused? Do we want to engage and the passenger facing side of operations focused, or do we want to get into some of that really technical, complex, highly specific work that does have an impact on how passengers ride trains? And finally, who is the audience? Who are the decision makers? How can we expand the target beyond just Amtrak executives to include interested members of the riding public, or not just our supporters, but passengers defined more broadly, as well as elected officials at the state and federal level. So I'm going to go over to Dave and let him kind of wrap it up. And then I have some questions, but I see there's 33 comments in the chat. I'm going to take a little bit of a moment to review. But Dave, I'll turn it over to you, and you can either ask the first question or give your thoughts.
Okay, now is my video going to come up here? I don't see it, but
your video will come up, yes, Dave.
okay, but I really think we need some support from staff on taking ideas that these committees come up with, and if they don't like the idea, discussion needs to be made, discussion needs to be had. And I know we get a lot of crazy issues going on here, but I think everybody's concern needs to be listened to. Also, now, of course, now with Zoom and things like that, we have a way of having committee meetings other than in somebody's bedroom in the evening when we get together. And I think that's going to solve a lot of the problems, because when we're at the meetings, we're all tired and don't want to have another committee meeting from 8 to 11 o'clock at night in somebody's bedroom. But what I'd like to do is to hear from others as to what their concern is. Now, I was trying to follow through on the chat room, but it would pop on and off so fast I couldn't get anything. And Sean, is this being recorded? So
yeah, this is being recorded.
Okay, so we'll be able to check these questions later on. So I'm looking for questions from anybody in any of the attendees. How are they going to be able to ask, or do we?
They can raise their hands.
Okay, that'll work.
You can raise your hand.
Actually, sorry, Sean. So I know there's been a number of questions in the chat, but if anybody actually has a question you want to, because we have some time here. If anybody has a question you want to ask of Dave or Sean live, please raise your hand, and I could get you to unmute, and you can ask that way. So actually, right off the bat, James Tilley. Let's see if this works here. I'll ask you to unmute.
Hey there.
Jim.
Can you hear me okay? There you go. So let me ask about the equipment committee. What kind of visibility has the output of the committee gotten with Amtrak, for example? And the reason I'm asking about that is what struck me yesterday about the discussion this is my age showing up, the head of marketing there, forgot his name.
Roger Harris.
Yeah, he really didn't seem equipped to talk about the long distance fleet renewal other than the soft upgrades they're doing now. I posed a question about what are you going to do about those 10 sleepers that are combination crew cars, and he never addressed that. He never answered it as far as I know. I was going to watch the video again, But then later on, he blamed the dining issue on the east, in part on the lack of crew dorms, when in fact he's sitting on 10 of them. So he seemed unequipped to deal with other than the core issues. And I'm just wondering, have we ever gotten any face time on anything the equipment committee's done? I certainly would like to be on the equipment committee.
They
Well,
do.
Go ahead, Dave.
They don't listen to us very little. There are some safety issues that are going on right now. There are 16 crew dormitory step-down cars that they got as stored serviceable. And the thing that I'm getting is the problem everybody's having is a shortage of employees to come in and do that. When they shut down last year, a lot of people just left and went someplace else. Now, that said, here in the Midwest, in the wintertime, because the Horizon cars are prone to freeze up, they use a lot of Superliner cars on the short Midwestern trains. Well, the profile of the locomotive is low enough that the exhaust fumes out of the locomotive get sucked right into the train if they don't have a panel over it to cover it up. And in my personal opinion, I think it's quite dangerous. I posed this problem to Harris a couple of years ago, and it went right in one ear and out the other. Another issue is baggage cars on the rear end of the train. Historically, the baggage cars are up front north because those are the cars in an accident that get ruined the worst. You notice when the Palmetto had its accident down in South Carolina, most of the injuries were in the car right behind the locomotive. If they'd had the baggage car up there, there would have been very few injuries. Luckily, there were no deaths in that thing. And again, I asked Harris about this a couple of years ago, in one ear and out the other. I mean, it's operational convenience, what's convenient for the operating department. And then you get sleeping cars running right up against the engine. Poor Lakeshore, Boston Lakeshore people. It goes on and on and on. Operating department is only interested in doing what they can to be efficient, not to take care of the passenger.
Okay. Well, let me just remind people, we're not talking about the equipment committee
This
is really about how do we structure the committees and the structure to allow RPA staff and committee members to work together to more effectively influence the conversation generally. I think that's helpful input and data points to talk about. And it emphasizes kind of one of the points I was making, which is it's not enough to just issue a letter to Amtrak and kind of let it happen, let it go from there. I mean, we can be technically right and still not influence change. And so, you know, I'm hoping, and I see Steve Mewson and Doug Curve raise their hands, so we'll get to them. But we think about how we target our communications in a way that allows us to influence the public conversation so that we're ready if we think there's something unsafe about what Amtrak's doing with their procurement process, we have the material ready so that when they announce their procurement, we're able to follow up and go to members of the press, Congress, and say, here's where we find faults with this procurement order. I see Dick Russ has said, you know, he's been part of the NGEC meetings. If he's part of the equipment committee, he's chair, I think. He can filter those conversations back and say, here are the deadlines coming up where we're headed for disaster, and I want us to get ahead of that and produce meaningful change. And so these are the kinds of again, abstract conversations. I probably set myself up by going into equipment committee as a case study, but we want to think about structural changes here. And Steve, go ahead. And
Steve Mewson?
Steven Mewson, yes, sorry.
I'm unmuted and I'm going to.
Yes, Steve, we can hear you.
And I'm going to get my video on. Okay. I'm going to be talking about routes and schedules committee because we do something a little bit different than the other committees. For one thing is, our mission is basically is to advise the staff and the board as to what we think the organization should be emphasizing as priorities. The problem is I got a committee of 20 people. And when I have a Zoom meeting, which I've been using at that particular point there, I maybe get 6 or 7. Very fortunate the last time. I want to thank Gary Landman for helping us as far as giving him a professional Zoom so that we were able to go more than 1 hour. Otherwise, I would have had to schedule several Zoom meetings back to back. But on the other hand, I can't have my committee meet every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks or so. Basically, we can get together maybe just before we're going to have a council meeting, but we can't go that much earlier. When I schedule on an individual route, I do a workup on it. I send it out over email. I get 1 or 2 responses, primarily from Dino, as far as on that particular thing. Very little is done until we actually have the Zoom. Then we have 6 or 7 people get together. We do discuss it. We do have a good conversation. Ideas are exchanged, but it's not 20 people. It's only a third of the particular committee. And we would get a lot more if we have this meeting at the actual in person when we have the fall and the spring meetings. So our committee would operate somewhat different. Another committee I'm on is Candidate Certification Committee. That we can do via email, and we do that quite often by circulating their CISs and approving it. And the committee works very, very well in the email structure. So the thing you have to remember is that each committee basically is going to be completely different as to how often it meets, who the participants are, and the method that they use to meet. And that's my comment on that particular thing. And as opposed to some of the other committees that do have to meet far more often with a smaller group of people because the delay cannot be done. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Steve. That's a good point. I do think, and you can see here, I'm just taking notes to help people track what's being said. I do hope we come out of this with some very specific actionable recommendations. I do. Who else? I'm sorry. So Doug Kerr, you have your hand raised.
Yep, Doug, you can now unmute.
Okay, can't seem to get the video up, but hopefully you can hear me.
Hey, we can hear you.
I just wanted to use as an example here it was an ad hoc committee that was formed to put together the council business meeting that we were supposed to have tomorrow in person, and will now be pushed to next March. But that committee worked very, very well, and we basically took that function away from staff, so staff didn't have to worry about it. And I'd like to see the council business meeting become a standing committee rather than an ad hoc committee. So I'll make that as my suggestion.
Okay. And Doug, are there any things that the ad hoc business meeting committee did in its administration and the way it kind of structured itself that you think would benefit the audience to hear?
We used Zoom for what were bi-weekly meetings through June, July, and I think we had 1 meeting in August. I can't remember now. And then, of course, once the decision was made to switch to Zoom rather than in person, we had to scramble quite a bit to figure out what to do with that. Much of that was done by email because it's short term, basically 2 to 3 months before the meeting. The rest of the year is open.
Okay. Okay. Right, and I think that's a very valid point, which is, I'm gonna give it its own box. Defined work periods.
And I think the important thing on that is that the business meeting, we have some ideas, we're doing some things differently, but there's really no reason for that to take staff time. That we asked Jim Matthews how much time he was going to need in the meeting, and he told us, and we asked other committees what they needed, and all of it was pretty much administrative that we could do on our own. We did not have to burden the staff for any of that function.
Right. That's good, and I think that's one of the things we've been trying to emphasize. Really, is how do we use advances in communications technology so not everything flows through DC, because that can be, it's just, it's going to be a choke point, and so that's a really good point. Thank you, Doug. I know there are others. Andrew C.
Andrew, I'm going to unmute you or ask you to unmute.
Okay, I have, thank you. Andrew Sable from Syracuse. And first of all, I want to thank RPA for all the work here. This session is good to know. I mentioned, or someone mentioned about various professionals in this organization. And I think we can't discount that. I mean, we have some great professional people. Dave Randall, right, certainly has a professional knowledge of railroading, and I can't even match that. Other people have professional credentials regarding mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computer engineering. I'm a civil engineer. So the profession, and other people are professional in business and marketing. These individuals, I think, need to at least be populating our various committees. For example, I'm part of the Routes and Schedules Committee. It's good to have some civil engineering knowledge there. Steve Musin has a more encyclopedic knowledge of the trains that ran there. But the point is, we need, I think, to distribute our professional people throughout these committees, as the case may be, based on what it is. So let's not discount those who maybe are in a profession, but also are here because we also like trains. And we want the best for them. That's it for me.
Well, that's a very interesting point. To what extent should we be trying to balance committee membership based on not just personal interest, but the skill sets, that each individual member brings from their professional life to that committee work. And I think that's a very good point. And it's something that probably there ought to be that kind of communication where if a committee feels like, oh, we could use someone who's an accountant in real life or an engineer, then let's go out there and recruit them. Do we have any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Jishnu has his hand raised.
Jishnu, yes.
Okay, let me try to get online here properly.
Yep, we can see you.
Okay. So one of the things that I noted in the chat also is that if we are expected to give feedback on work that is in progress towards developing a specification that's going to be sent out by Amtrak or whoever, we need to be able to get hold of early drafts. There is no point in giving feedback after they have completely decided what they're going to do. To give meaningful feedback, we need access to drafts. And that's where I think RPA can play a role, because it is very difficult for individuals to go poking around getting drafts.
Access drafts of preliminary Right. Well, you know, that's a very good point. I think we have tried, but probably been inconsistent to disseminate that to council. I think it helps if we have, if we really focus, if we do drill down on that committee structure, and you know, we were giving broad avenues for input when we were going through some of the regional rail studies in the Midwest and Southeast, and disseminating those documents. You know, that was managed by the FRA.
You know, my comment mainly was in the context of NGEC. They
Right.
had open drafts. They shut the dang thing down and said that you can't get copies of them unless you are a company or something.
Yeah. Well, and maybe, I don't know if Dick would want to comment, but this is in fact a point, which is I'm sure Dick had access to some early drafts. I bet he was given them on kind of a need to know basis, and he's basing a lot of his professional reputation on his ability to not just go ahead and link that to whatever passenger train forum.
That's why RPA needs to have a standing in some of these places.
Yeah, well, listen, we'll you can see the number of committees that came out of the IIJA that mentioned passenger organizations. So we absolutely will. But I do think it's worth mentioning that it's worth, we don't have to go full on NDA, but I think there ought to be a little bit of an understanding that being part of a committee grants you access to a higher level of information than you might have just as a general council member, or definitely a general supporter. And so, you know, as we work with committees to get them access to sensitive information, we ought to think about what kind of responsibilities come with accessing that. But yes, your points were very well taken.
Thanks.
I see we have Steve Strauss, and then we'll go Mark. Steve?
Steve, you can go ahead and unmute.
Great. So I wanted to come back to the sort of 2 points. One is we could probably find that Amtrak would be more open to us if we weren't always so negative on Amtrak. We need to find some people that are willing to work more closely with Amtrak and not always think that we know all the answers. And then the other point, and I say that, you know, as a retired government bureaucrat in the transportation field. And then the other thing on the equipment issue, those of you who were listening yesterday, the what's his name, Harris, he mentioned that they didn't really know what to do with the issue of the bi-level equipment in terms of replacing it, because no one makes it. And it would be very difficult to economically put in an order for that small number of cars. So we may want to look at the issue of just going to an all single level fleet for Amtrak, which would give them a bigger base number and allow them to order more economically, you know, buy sets of new cars every 5 years or so with about 200 at a time. And that would probably be better for the US manufacturing industry than the way it's done now. So that's something that the equipment committee folks need to take a serious look at. Thanks.
Good point, Steve.
I think those are very good points. And it's something I think that we've tried to do. It's part of being political, you know. Sometimes you just got to suck it up and say nice things about someone, even if disagree with them, because you want to be at the table. Because if you're not at the table, you're on the table. Although, you know, again, it's you know, I guess the counter to that, and I don't think it's necessarily obviates it or negates it, but certainly something to influence is I look at the Regional Plan Association as a nice model for constructive criticism, and they can be quite blunt when they look at some of the plans that come out of the New York metropolitan region, the metro, the MCA. but I think they've built up a little bit of a institutional reputation as people who kind of spit it straight, give you the straight truth. And I think we can do both. So I think we can both not engage in ad hominems against Amtrak and Amtrak management and listen to them and hear if there are factors we should be aware of when we disagree with a lot of the choices they make, but also at the same time, we ought to have lines where we say, this is bad for the passenger, and we're gonna say that. I see we have, I think Mark Quam was next up.
Yeah, Mark Quam, and then Brad McCurdy in the chat actually says he can't raise his hand, so I'm gonna call on him after Mark. So Mark, go ahead and unmute.
Thanks, everyone. Mark Quam here from Wisconsin. I guess one thing that I'm curious to know, with some of these different committees that we have within RPA, I think as a division leader, and I'm a division leader, I think one thing that I think would be really helpful for other people that are division leaders is to have kind of a more in touch or networking with some of these committees and with other division leaders, because I often feel it's hard to get people from within our own regions, to get monthly updates. And I'm just wondering if there's some way that we could develop some kind of a program here or something where, the division leaders could be a little more tuned in to, what's going on with different committee people, or be included on some, networking, committee discussions or whatnot. I just find it frustrating because as a division leader, I feel, a responsibility that I should be more connected with other states within my region or with other division leaders. And I'm just wondering, if that's something that we could look into or maybe explore to maybe build a better communication. And, because I think often, people that are division leaders, they might be able to bring things to the table for other committee members or as the organization as a whole. And I just would like to kind of see how we could build upon that. Thanks.
That's a great suggestion, Mark. Thanks for putting it forth. I don't off the top of my head have ideas for best practices about how we do this, but I think it's absolutely worth pursuing, and something I would certainly like to work with division leaders on and the committee leaders on, and perhaps there's a sidebar that we could set up after this council meeting is wrapped up, and think about how we do that. Without creating, we don't want to create unnecessary reporting burdens, but we do want there to be a transparent flow of information. With the understanding again that, as we just mentioned, if we're sharing sensitive information, there might be some confidentiality requirements for us to get a better sense of where things are when they're in the drafting process. So, but very good. That's a very good input. I think we have Jim Tilley.
No, actually, I'm gonna as Brad in the chat said he didn't have the chance to raise his hand. Actually, Brad McCurdy, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Here you go, Brad. You're up.
All right. I have a couple of questions, actually, kind of piggybacking on people's comments and whatnot. Back to Vice President Harris, I guess, at Amtrak.
Yeah, Roger Harris.
I'm sorry?
Roger Harris.
Roger Harris. I guess it was kind of my comment was he was all smiles yesterday on the video and how happy he is to work with RPA and blah, 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 blah. But it seems like I'm kind of wondering, is it just lip service, or has there been some, sort of animosity between the two groups that he's hiding, kind of from the past, that I'm not aware of. If it's a new open era of communication, then, you would think that he would want to listen to everything that we as a respected organization have to say going forward. So, obviously everybody has to do a good job of listening on both sides. And sometimes you have to agree to disagree on things, but, we have a a good idea, and maybe sometimes a better idea of, with a broader constituency that comes to the table here, maybe he's kind of tunnel vision in some of his way of thinking. And it's just, something I'm throwing out there. I don't know if there are any thoughts on that one, in particular, but.
Well, I think I will just make the point broadly and not make anything specific about Roger, but rather the kind of the Amtrak Rail Passengers Association relationship, which is, I think Amtrak for a very long time, back when we were NARP, was in survival mode at all times. And that was, they didn't have a lot of dedicated, they didn't have a deep bench of support. And that was where we got a lot of the leverage is we were the people delivering bodies on the front line when they were faced with a lot of existential threats. They were on starvation diets. That has changed recently. And so I think there has been perhaps a shift in the way Amtrak and this institution has looked at us, and they say, like, record riderships, we have the Section 209 program, now we have these states that are kind of our clients as well. And maybe there's less need to work with rail passengers in quite the same fashion we used to do, quite the revolving door. Sorry, someone's using a leaf blower. I might close my window. However, I believe we have won some very important policy battles with them. Southwest Chief preservation was a big one, where we were part of the vanguard there in attacking that bustitution plan, preventing it from happening, putting kind of manacles on them through the appropriations process. And also, this 3X daily, Congress invited us to come because they were very unhappy with Amtrak's entire approach there, because they said, "Wait, hold on, we just gave you like extra, how many, like an extra billion plus for pandemic funding, and now you're gonna go to 3X daily on all these states." And so we were able to work with Congress and come up with some binding provisions. And so I think it's understood that rail passengers has the ear of members of Congress, which is again why it's not enough to be right. I don't know if anyone listens to Strongtown's the podcast or read the blog. I highly recommend it. But it was an engineer who worked in a couple highway departments, couple engineering firms. He looked at what the massive subsidization of these highway departments was doing to small towns in the Midwest, and he said, "This is like crazy. We're plowing through these vibrant communities and leaving, kind of just destroying the economic base." And so he issued some papers. He made some really tight arguments based on the data, and then kind of sat back and waited for the world to change. And he's like, "Okay, well, nothing happens." So I realized it doesn't necessarily, the best arguments don't necessarily win the day. It's about kind of organizing the movement. So we ought to be thinking less about, okay, we gave Amtrak the right answers, and then we're going to get angry with them if they don't immediately take it. We ought to be thinking about, how do we marshal the stakeholder base we have access to, the states, passengers, disabled rights activists, members of Congress who listen to us, and give them the materials they need to understand what the right decision is. And so that's a more complicated task. And it's more complicated necessarily than just come up with a spreadsheet of what we would like to see in terms of the consist breakdown, or a bullet point list of some discontinued routes that we would like to see reevaluated. There has to be we have to show more work in that process. And so that's what I'm hoping we talk about and come walk away with is a better plan to shape the argument beyond just Roger Harris,
Right.
the executive suite at Amtrak, and start making the case more broadly. And Howie, I see you've raised your hand. Sorry if I'm cutting in line here.
Howie Stein?
I'm here.
Go ahead, Howie.
Since we're picking on Roger, in the reason that people want to travel via Amtrak or not, it's got it's an entire system approach if you look at it, starting with dialing up the phone number or getting on the website, to is your luggage delivered to the right place when you're leaving the station. I will be contacting Roger because I had during this meeting experienced trying to take a trip from here to Washington. I get on in Philadelphia and I go to Washington. This is not a great project, or it shouldn't be. It took me probably 8 or 9 phone calls, and I've lost track of how many times I've entered the data in their website to get that done, go down and come back, because of how totally mucked up that part of their system is. How do they expect to get people on their trains if they can't make reservations? And that's got to be part of our approach too, their customer interface from square one.
Yeah, again, I would really like us to think systematically about this and not just have this be like, let's email the guy who talked to us. We did work with, the guy who spoke with, I'm sorry, the member of Congress who gave that video today, Representative Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania. We organized with Labor, with Republican and Democratic members of Congress around the call center issue, because we were saying, you can solve this call center. You've had people move from Riverside, and now you're going to lay them off, and we're going to outsource it to who? To a call center in Florida, which is going to be, it's there because it's flexible. So they're going to go from selling vacuum cleaners to trying to help people navigate the national network. That doesn't make any sense. And so we did that. And again, we did get some language and appropriations and a stop loss essentially. But I think they're having staffing issue across the board, and we may need to address it. So I mean, angry emails are okay, and I think I would hope that Amtrak has an effective enough communication system where they're getting those the customer dissatisfaction. We are happy to pass it along, but I think what we ought to do is think about going public with that, and how do we quantify that in a way where we really can make the case to the broader public. So, Joe, how much time do we have left? I want to get to Virgil and Nathaniel. Sorry, and
so we were scheduled for both workshops were going an hour 15, and you have about 4 minutes of that time slot.
Got my phone. Okay. Virgil, why don't you go first, and then no, sorry, Nathaniel, you were first, and then Virgil, you can take us home, and then we'll see if we can't wrap it up. This has been a great conversation, everyone. I'm gonna see if we can structure this, but we do. We're gonna have some brain drain here soon if we don't have a break. So why don't you open up, Nathaniel? You go first.
All right, Nathaniel, gonna unmute. There you go. Nathaniel, there is, you are unmuted, but there's no sound coming out of your mic.
Maybe a headphone issue. Not sure.
Actually, Nathaniel said hand off to Virgil. So
Okay. Sorry about that. Virgil.
Hey, I was just mentioning, we at one point we've used Slack, or I've used Slack obviously as a platform, to engage in groups, and that maybe for different committees we could maybe agree upon that, or to have subcommittees as well. I found it interesting. It's helpful. It respects people's time. But secondarily, there are a lot of groups. I had a great conversation with a group called All Rail, which is out of the EU, and share a lot of the goals that I think we kind of get down into and really talk about what the operator does and how it responds to the consumer.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of the thing that I feel some of these comments are obviously centering on, but then there's also, of course, this question of how infrastructure is provided and funding it, which we know costs money. And, at some point, I don't know if it's a separate subcommittee or whatever, but there needs to be a little bit of a fox behind the, everybody getting Amtrak, to make it run faster sometimes. And maybe that is, kind of recognition of which item is better covered by which. And, there could be some ideas that we respect the need for large scale investments in infrastructure, but at the same time, provide the groups that run, Amtrak the ability to say, hey, we can put this off. We'll still manage, what's going on in terms of providing the access and everything else, but give them an answer that they might actually like, maybe, still being the overall shell, but and that could actually be a committee. So instead of taking other people's ideas, they're confidential. We've developed this ourselves and send it out. And have something then at a hearing, we could present and say, hey, here's an alternative way to do this, and we've worked through it with some reputable operators, and here we go. That's it for me.
Thanks, Virgil. I think that's a good point. And I know you're not shy about doing the work. But also at the same time, I've read papers that I think I understand on a lot of financing issues. Maybe not actually. I know enough to know that I don't understand them fully. But also, I think you butted your head up against some political walls. So I think it's very well taken, this kind of the points you were making about presenting solutions, in addition to identifying the problems. And finding an audience for them, and figuring out who needs to hear it besides just Amtrak. Do we want to? I don't want to cut off conversation if people feel like this is robust. But Nathaniel, do you want to try again, or should we go to Jim Tilley and then Andrew?
Let's see if this works. S unmute.
Can you hear me?
There it is.
Yeah. So I was just thinking a lot about the discussion about Roger Harris's presentation, and I like Roger Harris, and I've been one of the people who's been writing annoyed letters to Roger Harris. I'm not. Sometimes it feels like parts of Amtrak don't know what other parts of Amtrak are doing, and most notably, Roger Harris said we're notifying the disability community about the updates on the projects, and they're not. The reports have disappeared. And there's other stuff going on like that. Like there's clearly something wrong at Amtrak's IT department. There's endless customer complaints about the website. And it's just not like Amtrak. There's a cultural problem at Amtrak of which is a classic bureaucratic problem of each department wants to go, no, we're doing fine, because they don't want the hammer to come down on them. And we as outsiders, we just want the whole thing to work. So there's some trick to saying this isn't working. You need to do better without it seeming like it's a criticism of individuals, when what we're really saying is you need to hire the right people and give them the right instructions. That's just my thought.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's a tough problem because being the management in exile for a quasi governmental agency is.
Can I add
it's
something
tough.
here?
I would just, Dave, before you.
Okay, I was gonna add, if they had a year to year's funding, they'd be able to get solve a lot of these institutional problems that they have. And hopefully with what's coming up ahead of us, that'll go away. Thank you.
Well, and that's a good point. That's a good point. I do want to, it was a point I was hoping to make. And so I'm glad you reminded me of it. We do have now a pivot point where we are going to Amtrak's, a lot of their arguments for why things didn't work were we are in starvation funding levels. There's a pandemic most recently. Congress is asking us to consistently run at a deficit, really at a capital rate, which they do because they don't really include depreciation for the NEC and the legislative report, the financials they give to Congress, so that we know that they're eating their capital assets. So now we're gonna hopefully see a change, and a lot of the excuses are not gonna be as relevant. And also there's gonna be, I think, interest in a group providing oversights, but it needs to be, the committee work needs to be very careful not to just try to make anecdata an argument, because there's nothing more tedious than listening to someone talk about how their airplane trip went off the rails. That's a horrible mixed metaphor. How their airplane trip went horribly awry. That is very boring. But if you can talk about it in terms of like a passenger bill of rights, or how we affect the air control system that has everyone waiting for hours on the tarmac, that becomes newsworthy. And then that becomes something we can produce. And all of a sudden the media is going to say Amtrak's receiving billions and billions and billions of extra dollars now. What are they doing with it? They're going to be looking for those stories. And so that's the things that committees need to start thinking about incorporating into their work. Andrew, you've had your hand up for a while.
Oh, there he is. Andrew, you can unmute.
Yeah, let's see here. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Coming in, loud and clear.
I just want to make a point with respect to our work on committees, that we need to foster the right improvements in the right places with respect to the network and try to be global about it. And, maybe we need, I think ultimately in the long range, maybe an effort kind of similar to, if you read the most recent issue of Passenger Train Journal, there was kind of a look back on the X2000 tour in the early 1990s that was a promotional effort with the Swedish Railway to bring Swedish railway technology to exhibition around the country. But the way I look at it is that we need to make a grand tour of the Amtrak system from a global perspective and look at, and I want to use one word here, we need to look at legibility. But I want to get a little bit of input from others. Do people agree with me when I say that the Amtrak system is the least legible? Things are harder to read. The cues you have to read, the lines you have to try to form at the stations. Penn Station is notorious for being the worst in New York City, but this is a problem everywhere. Folks don't know where to line up to board these trains. Folks don't know who to present their tickets to. Folks can't understand the signage. People can't hear the PA announcements. I think there is a problem of legibility and making the system easier to use for those with a disability or for those who've never been on a train before. And we need to look for a global solution, maybe from a different international railway system like the Japanese or the Swedish, to make this a legible system. I think legibility is a problem. I mean, do other folks agree with me or no?
I will agree with you. I think this sounds like a really excellent conversation for the service delivery committee to have. And I think it's exactly the kind of work that I was very much hoping would be stimulated by this entire workshop. So Andrew, I thank you for closing out on that good note. I really want those kinds of ideas to percolate and develop, because I think it's absolutely, that's the kind of reports that if we pursued this idea, researched it, came up with our own like best practices, recommendations to improve the Amtrak system. There are so many media markets I could go sell that in. There are so many states who are kind of irritated with Amtrak and how they do business, that I could go present that to and say, let's have a conversation here about how do we apply a little pressure to make sure that we are having the good cues for passengers, and a passenger focused system of information, make the system legible, to use your phrases. So I hope that work does continue. I noticed a lot of you said you did want to participate in these committees. I think what I'm going to do is try to have some one-on-one conversations with committee chairs, and perhaps we even have an all-hands meeting with committee chairs and some of the division directors as per the recommendation we see. I think from Mark, and make sure that we don't just lose any momentum here, that a lot of these ideas are captured, and that we start thinking about how we implement some of the ideas that you all have thrown out here. And with that, I think we are well over time. Thank you, everyone, for your good ideas, for your patience, for your work. And anything you want to close out with, Dave?
Nope.
Beautiful. Okay, Joe, I'm going to turn it back over to you, unless you want me to close it out. I don't know.
Let me unmute now. I was worried about everybody else. No, so actually, you see my screen now. We're going to close up for the day. Thank you to all our speakers, from Doug Kerr to Ken Breyer, the chairman, to Jim Matthews, who I know was on a number of meetings behind the scenes. Diggs, today was technically our day on the Hill. So there's been a number of meetings behind the scenes. Dan, Tom, and Barry for my group, the breakout session. Thank you for all of you who took part. Sean and Dave, you did a great job. All the questions. Great conversation today. I was pleased to kind of just sit back and watch it all go in the chat. But we are going to wrap up things today, but we will be back tomorrow, because there will be no business council meeting, but we are going to do some staff office hours. So from 12 to 2 o'clock tomorrow Eastern, I will send out a Zoom link to all of you who RSVP'd for the week to come join us. We're going to have a couple breakout rooms. John Z will be around, myself and Madison Butler, the field team, Sean and Jim, and maybe a special guest or two. We're trying to get the chairman of the board to swing on over and join Jim, just to kind of, come into our office door, come knock on our door, have a discussion about legislative questions. You have questions about field team operations, our trips that we've taken, fundraising with John Z and some of the board members, questions maybe even just about this week, follow-ups with Sean about today. Come on by. Our doors will be virtually open all day. And so we will see you at noon Eastern tomorrow for office hours. And I said the Zoom link will be sent out probably around 11 o'clock Eastern in the morning. So you guys will all have it right in time. So on behalf of the staff, our president, Jim Matthews, and everybody, thank you for attending. Thank you for sitting around for a number of hours the last couple of days. We can't undo what we do without your participation, without your efforts. So to all of you, from the bottom of our heart, thank you, and have a great Tuesday.